Never let a good crisis go to waste. I don't know if truer or more applicable words have been said that can apply to the last 3 years in the industry. Let me pause for a moment and thank WeSing and SSIA for inviting me the opportunity to speak not once but twice back to back. It's fantastic. But it's really, truly, it's an honor and it's humbling to be here to celebrate the 55th anniversary of the Singaporean semiconductor industry. Never let a good crisis go to waste. If there's one industry that is familiar and commonly experiences crises, it's the semiconductor industry. It's fair to argue between every 18 to 36 months, there is a mini crisis in demand and supply. It's the cyclical nature of this industry, and it has defined the industry for over 50 years. The difference with COVID, which I'm not here to convince you that COVID was a different crisis. That would be a very short speech, right? We all lived through it. Some of us got gray hair, some of us lost our hair, some of us gained weight, and we all got to know our family members very intimately as we worked from home and had children running around and dogs and animals running through the screens as we operated meetings on video. But what I am here to say is, did we take the right lessons out of COVID to be able to apply to the next crisis in the future? And when I suggest the next crisis, I don't suggest a negative one. I suggest a crisis of growth and positivity. What was unique over the last 3 years is we had 4 factors that in and of themselves would have been able to generate a significant and substantial crisis. We had massive demand growth. When the whole industry thought that demand was going to stop, automotive companies canceled a bunch of orders. We had government spending that created free capital and consumer confidence at a degree we'd never seen before. So at initial onset of COVID, we believe demand's going to compress. We see huge demand growth. Number 2, the change in ways of working. Zoom, Teams, digital compute, graphics, everybody falling in love in Bitcoin and cryptocurrency and Dogecoin. I remember my friends buying them on the cell phone. Doge to the moon, as Elon Musk was tweeting. Created a mix issue. The mix in the semiconductor industry changed. Then at the same time, we had geopolitical concerns. And it's not that this industry hasn't been familiar or consciously aware of geopolitical concerns. It's just never been integrated into our daily operations at the scale that was needed to respond to what happened in the last 3 years. And last but not least, we had sudden supply vanishing. We had our own internal factories and employees not be able to go to work. We had suppliers and suppliers of suppliers be shut down, even to the point we had full countries and municipalities close. So we had 4 crises that in and of themselves collided and compounded upon each other. But did we take the right lessons from those crises? At Genpact, as you saw on that screen, we have the privilege of working with many of the leading supply chain semiconductor companies. That includes IDMs and foundries and OSATs, fabless companies, key equipment companies, even some of the material suppliers. When I sit and talk to executives, they consistently took 3 learnings away from COVID and the last 3 years, and hopefully you guys did too. Number 1, and we just spoke about it a lot on stage, failure to do supplier diversification. In supply chain, the desire to be efficient and ensure consistency of supply, particularly in an industry that's heavily dependent upon qualification process, led to a lot of single throat choke from a supply standpoint. And it also made companies very challenged when they needed to find secondary and tertiary sources of supply. Number 2, while geopolitical concerns and risk were always considered, it wasn't factored into the manufacturing network design. And you see that with leading companies today intentionally selecting new locations to put fabrication sites. And then number 3, and this is, I think, what we heard consistently in the last panel discussion, is the tools, technology, and analytics enabling a process through visibility and an operating model to take action and enable agility in times of uncertainty was underinvested. It was across the industry. So, with those 3 key learnings, I would also say that we as an industry did not waste the crisis. We got semiconductor as a commodity, to be viewed as a strategic commodity almost on the same level as water and energy. We got governments like the US the EU, Japan, China, Korea, to enact some type of form of a CHIPS Act. And if you give me 2 minutes to indulge in a personal story, you got my father to speak semiconductor. My dad is a high school football coach. He knows nothing about supply chain and very little about semiconductor. Fast forward to Thanksgiving of 2021, and he's sitting at the dinner table explaining to my aunts and uncles why the CHIPS Act signing will not magically solve the shortage of supply chain in the next 6 months. He's talking about Fab Bill, he's talking about ASML's order book, and I'm like, oh my gosh, who is this guy? And A, can I hire him, because he is retired? And then 5 seconds later, he's sitting to my grandmother, and he's explaining why her car isn't going to show up for 6 months. And no matter what the Democratic senator from Detroit says, it has nothing to do with just semiconductor chips. It also has to do with other players in the ecosystem. It put a spotlight on us as an industry. Now, what I would say is, we're about to step into the next crisis. The next crisis, and I choose the word revolution for a specific reason, because everyone, when you hear revolution, you immediately think industrial revolution. And why do you think industrial revolution? Because you think it materially changed the products that enabled consumers' lives. And the reason why I think we sit on the precipice of the digital AI, or what I like to call the sensory revolution, isn't because you can't watch a sporting event or a show on MSNBC or a show of your child for 30 minutes and not see a commercial about AI, machine learning, ChatGPT, or Gen AI. Yes, there's a ton of media hype. But I think that we have 4 similarly colluding powers and factors that are going to hit us at the same time. We have an acceleration into cleaner and greener energy, which requires greater content density and compute power than fossil fuels. We have a rapid shift to EV, which we heard in the earlier morning presentations, creates 100x the number of chips required in combustible vehicles. We have a generation, well, let me pause there for a second. We have compute expectations from sensory organizations, AI, machine learning, and to Gen AI that is going to drive continual needs for both compute and graphic chips. But last but not least, and most importantly, we have a new generation of consumers in which they believe everything that they interact with should be able to communicate with them digitally. And to further put this in emphasis, I'm going to refer to Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett, I think everybody here knows who Warren Buffett is, correct? Yes? Can I get a head nod? Anybody? Awesome. Fantastic. He has for years remained abstinent of investing in tech companies. It wasn't when he had his Ivy League educated analysts tell him to buy into Apple that he bought the stock. It wasn't when he had his quant team tell him why it was so important that he bought the stock. It wasn't even after decades of Tim Cook and Steve Jobs sending him iPhones that he gave up his 20-year-old flip phone. It was on a drive to an ice cream shop with his great-grandchildren and their friends, in which for the entire 23 minutes, they never took their eyes or their fingers off of the phone while communicating and collaborating with each other. In that moment, he recognized that the way in which the future generations will expect to communicate and interact with the world is different. It is digitally enabled, and as a result, it is dependent upon the semiconductor industry. As we move forward, yes, we see a $1 trillion outlook for the industry. And yes, again, this is why I tell the Warren Buffett story, investment. As Francois told us this morning, investment will be mission critical to the sustainability of that industry. And it's not just capital investment. Yes, we need $1.2 trillion for the front-end manufacturing. And that doesn't include all the investment we need for the equipment guys and all the investment we need for their suppliers and their suppliers. And yes, we might be 1 million people short. But I challenge that if we do not change the paradigm in which we work, both across the enterprise and with the extended network, this investment is not going to materialize in our ability to be more responsive to this next crisis of growth as we were responsive to the last crisis of COVID and geopolitical challenges. With that, I want to leave you guys with 3 strategic business imperatives that I think are applicable to every semiconductor organization present in Singapore, particularly some of the Singaporean SMEs, and it can be further applied to semiconductor companies globally. Number 1, we need to ensure that we're building resiliency in the local ecosystem, and this includes an understanding of overall supply control and visibility. Number 2, We need to design and drive sustainable operations, and not just sustainable from an ESG standpoint, but sustainability of supply and coordination, which means integrated business planning and orchestration across the enterprise, with KPIs and visibility to sustainability and green footprint included in that process. And number 3, we need to invest in staffing and talent planning, but we need to do it by a change of mindset, because the reality is we're not going to simply find 1 million people who are highly qualified to do the job that we need to do in the next 5 years. 2%. 2% of companies have visibility into their Tier 3 supply capacity, inventory, and capability. But in the semiconductor value chain, depending on whether you're a foundry, fabless, IDM, OSAT, material supplier, 64 to 82% of your revenue disruption sits at Tier 2 or lower. So if you are going to be effective, regardless of how much capital is put into the industry, you have to have better visibility and control and orchestration with sub-tier suppliers. And I know some of you are going to say, that's impossible. They won't share us the information. I'm here to say that it's not impossible, because we have clients who are currently doing directive buys for Tier 3 and Tier 4. It's not impossible to do network mapping, and as KL and Peter and the other panelists just talked about, because there's technologies out there that allow you to do multi-tier network modeling and be able to assess if the bottleneck sits even below the traditional Tier 1 or Tier 2. But you have to take action in redefining what your supplier relationship management program looks like. Number 2, you have to partner with suppliers. Some of our leading partners like ASML and Advantest, they make news for this all the time, right? ASML bought Berlin Glass in 2020. Why? Not because they want to become vertically integrated, but because it became a mission-critical aspect of their supply chain, and Berlin Glass could not invest at the level that ASML needed them to in order for ASML to hit their goals. Same thing with Advantest. So you have to look at doing efforts around what we call cognitive sourcing. Find key suppliers that you can build a different type of relationship with, and/or suppliers that might not even be in the industry, that with joint investment can become an expansionary base of the supply pool. And then number 3, in order to be effective, this has to be integrated into the daily operations of life. So there's no point in doing a supply and demand match process or an integrated business plan or an S&OP plan or a long-term strategic plan if you're not incorporating for these type of risks when you're modeling the supply chain. 80%. 80% of organizations will never achieve beyond a stage 3 maturity in their integrated business planning process. Why? This isn't brand new. It's been around since 1978, according to Oliver White. The only thing that's happened in the last 20 to 35 years is we've added new technology to digitize the process and make it smarter. But at the same time, 80% of CEOs and CFOs have told analysts that they will spend money on technology and process transformation to be able to drive quicker, more agile, more data-driven decision-making. That is IBP in its definition. So senior leadership understands the need for it. The capability is there, but companies have been able to imperfectly realize this. How do we solve it? I think first and foremost, we need to make sure that when we're bringing different functional teams to the table in an integrated business planning process, they each have ownership for the data inputs that they provide, and there's truly a drive to align the enterprise KPIs for orchestration purposes as opposed to the functional KPIs for optimization purposes. And what I mean by this is people who are traditionally measured on inventory might have their personal KPIs negatively impacted because it's not in the best interest of the company. People who are perfectly driven on OEE, right, and factory efficiency might have their KPIs negatively impacted because a postponement strategy makes more sense because the demand is too soft or uncertain. It also requires companies to bring in more than just a supply chain team. I bet a lot of your companies have a great planning process and it's all done in supply chain. But is the NPI team and the engineering team equally accountable to the inputs of the plan? Is the ESG team equally accountable and included in the definition of KPIs and performance metrics? And then last but not least, what we see is a lot of companies simply lack the capital to invest in the technologies of leading generation planning systems and or the talent to be able to run the process. Right? If you have an integrated business planning process of 1 or 2 people in a company of 10,000, it's very unlikely that that's going to become the lifeblood of your company. You are not going to wake up every day and make decisions based on what 1 or 2 people put together on a couple PowerPoint slides. It's not going to happen. So what we've consistently seen is companies, in an effort to do everything internally and not leverage partners in the space, and or not leverage maybe planning as a service applications from some of the technology providers, they've simply just not done it. That not doing it is not going to be an answer going forward. 1 million. If the industry achieves the revenue projection of $1 trillion by 2030, we will be short 1 million people across the semiconductor industry. I think Francois shared it was around 270, 300,000 in the manufacturing space. Then you got to factor in everybody else. You got to factor in all the operations people. You got to factor in the planners. You got to factor in what's happening at suppliers and suppliers of suppliers. And according to the Federal Reserve Bank of the US, again, I already declared I was American earlier, so don't hold that against me, but 90% of CEOs and CFOs, their number one concern right now is talent availability. It's not cost of capital, it's not macroeconomics, it's talent availability. So as a result of that, we're the industry that's most pressed with it. So I would challenge companies, and what we've seen some of our leading partners do, is traditional staffing approaches just simply will not support the industry's growth. It's infeasible. We have to look to identify where there are opportunities to gain leverage by experts and partners. And Peter highlighted some of the stuff that they're doing with logistics partners and LSPs at Infineon in the last stage. We just had a discussion about how we can leverage some analytics firms to help drive some change in behaviors, help automate some of the demand creation process or the consensus forecasting process or product segmentation or inventory. But there's pockets of opportunity across the entire value chain where the job doesn't necessarily have to be done by an employee on your W-2. And there's partners that are actually better and more equipped to do it and provide you leverage, because while it's a special skill set, it might not be a 40-hour-a-week job. So while I continue to insist with all of our companies and clients that being effective and exceptional at execution and supply chain is mission critical, I also challenge and question who and in which roles does that person have to be sitting on your payroll versus do you just need the talent to be a special designated provider in that area. With that, I thank you all for your time. I appreciate the opportunity to present today. And again, I'm humbled by the opportunity to speak and be part of this wonderful event. And thank you all for having me. I think it now opens to Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Michael. All right. Any other questions over at Slido? Just to check once again. All good with Slido? Okay, probably when I want to catch you later during the break.
No questions? All right.
Okay, there are one actually.
Okay.
Yeah, there's one. There's 5 votes for that.
5 votes for 1. All right, there we go.
Are you able to see from there? We have what are the biggest risks for companies while embarking on the 3 transformative initiatives you mentioned, and how to mitigate them?
Yeah, a great question. Thank you. So I think the number one biggest risk is the willingness of the culture to change. Nothing that I think I talked about up here today is like earth-shattering, right? Most of you have probably heard about integrated business planning. Most of you have probably heard about better collaboration and connectivity with your suppliers. Most of you have probably had internal discussions around changing your SOM policies since COVID. I think the biggest challenge, right, is companies are not necessarily structured to drive that change. And in a lot of the things that we just, or a lot of the things that our presentation covered, it requires people in functional areas to give up power for the benefit of the whole enterprise. And that's a challenging thing to do if it's not driven from a senior leadership standpoint down, and if you're not also changing performance metrics. Even everybody who is benevolent in their nature If you guys have a bonus scorecard that's tied to a KPI, it's hard for you not to subconsciously drive activities and decisions that benefit that KPI. So if you're not realigning incentive structures, it's going to be very challenging. So I think the first thing is you need to have a leadership team that has a vision and stamina, because these transformations are very hard from a change management standpoint. You have to properly incentivize the rest of the organization to transfer out of what might be good for their functional silo at the behest of what's best for the overall enterprise. And then number 3, I would say there's a talent shortage. So it's great to say, let's go do it. And you might get 50 people in your team to say, yes, I want to be part of the integrated business planning process. But if those people are not technology savvy and they don't like tools, and they're not analytically inclined to be able to look at what if scenarios and proactive planning, no matter what you throw at it, it's not going to be successful. So I would say that those are 3 things that are the biggest risk. It's obviously not infeasible, right? I've seen some people in the room from Micron. I mean, we started an IBP journey with them in 2015. And there was an article in Forbes published about a year ago about how it's helped change their supply chain. So it's clearly things that are feasible and can be executed against. But a lot of the challenges and the roadblocks actually become internal talent, change management, and leadership objectives.
Thank you for answering that question. We'll take one more question from Mr. Michael. Can businesses still consider employing just-in-time or minimal inventory practices to tackle supply chain challenges in the present day?
Yeah, I think Peter slightly answered this when we were on stage earlier. The short answer is yes, you can, but you're doing that understanding that there's a cone of confidence of demand that you're going to let go. Right? And I think that as a company looks at it and says, from a cost standpoint, this is as much working capital as we're willing to hold, or this is what we're looking at from a turn standpoint, that then has to be communicated back upstream to the sales team and the commercial teams, and say, understanding, look, hey, some of these orders, we have shaped the supply chain to intentionally not be able to take on this level of growth or this level of volatility. And when it happens, we're not going to chase it. And that becomes really hard, right? We had a client who actually did this. And they were very good, but we had to build a report, and I won't say his name. He's retired now, but it was a CEO's report, and we put his name on it. And every time you get on the phone with Tim Cook, and they would change all the priorities, the report would calculate how much churn and how much waste we just created in the supply chain. And until we could get him to stop doing it with Tim Cook, it didn't matter if we got the rest of the organization to buy in. So yes, it can be done, but it has to be done with a full understanding that as volatility and growth happens, that is going to put some orders at risk, and you can't then chase every order. They keep popping up on the screen. Should I just answer them?
Okay, maybe we just take one more question because of time. We just take one more question. Maybe you want to pick the questions you like to share? We have 2 more new questions.
What skills should someone in supply chain? Oh man, gosh, those are both hard. Okay.
How about you want to mention about elaborating more on how to get visibility on tier 3 suppliers?
Yeah, so I'll handle that one quickly. So from a technology standpoint, there are tools out there that do tier 2, tier 3 mapping, right? So what they'll do is they'll say, okay, here's your tier 1 suppliers, they buy from these companies. Some of the tools will just say traditionally they buy from these companies, other ones will use some analytics to say, we think specifically for you, they buy from those companies. So there is some technology to do with it. But what we found where companies are most successful is it's a minimum requirement to be a supplier of my company. Now, I understand not everybody has the same market power as each other in the room. So some company, one of our clients can stand up and say, you want to supply us, this is the minimum expectation. You need to be able to tell me where your material is coming from, what's the material lineage, and what's the material lineages of their suppliers. That's the easiest thing. But if you can't have it, then what we found is we had to find a way to make it, there's some value to them. So if you're providing us this data, right, we're willing to take on greater inventory risk. If you're providing us data, we're willing to share a greater outlook of our forecast for a longer period of time. But there has to be some kind of quid pro quo in which you're providing them information and or a commitment to allow them to be more efficient and more profitable in their operations.